Welcome to Transformers, the podcast about how business people and policymakers are creating a sustainable future. I'm your host, Kai Embren. Today, my guest is John Elkington, a world authority on corporate responsibility and sustainable capitalism, a best-selling author and a serial entrepreneur. He is known for his role as an ambassador for the future. His last book is Green Swans, and he is also the founding partner of Volans. Welcome, John.
Thank you, Kai, and I'm very much looking forward to the conversation.
The last time I did an interview with you was in Dublin 2011 about conflict minerals and the role of the IT sector.
I sort of remember that, but you've got a better memory than I have.
We're working in the same field and have made sustainability to our lifetime goal. We have in common is that we are both very optimistic.
Yes.
And this talk is our first under a pandemic. And I will start to go into this pandemic systemic shock. What did it expose? And how will you connect into the black swans and the needs of the green swans?
Yes, I mean, I think people had been expecting a pandemic for quite a long time. Some governments had set up units to, manage the process. The US even shut its own unit down ahead of the pandemic. So as a species, we sort of are sometimes incredibly intelligent and sometimes borderline idiotic. I think what the pandemic has exposed is rather remarkable. I think it's been like a global X-ray. I think it's suddenly illuminated parts of the world that we simply don't pay very much attention to or don't see normally. So, for example, I think wealth divides have become very much more obvious to people. The whole Black Lives Matter campaign has sort of erupted in the middle of all of this. You've got the awareness increasingly of the differences in public healthcare provision. And then at the other end, you've got issues around tax avoidance and tax havens. So, the corporate responsibility agenda has exploded during this period. But I think also people have become sensitive, probably for the first time in their lives quite often, to the fact that we live in a very fragile system or set of nested systems. And COVID-19 has thrown up evidence of that. And so people are becoming very nervous about, if that's COVID-19, what does the climate emergency look like? And what beyond that does, say, the biodiversity emergency look like? So I think it's been a big shock.
Yeah. I see also in my dialogues with people and also more and more reflection on what's happening and which are the road to the future.
Yeah.
And when I look into your book Green Swans, and you talk about the VICT or super VICT development, and why has the world become increasingly VICT or even super VICT?
Well, it was interesting. I was talking this morning to a professor in Cairo in Egypt, and we were discussing the way in which the world is becoming crowded with what Nassim Nicholas Taleb described as black swans back in 2007. And these are problems that come out of the blue. They're a complete surprise. They have an off-the-scale impact. And then afterwards, we very often fail to properly understand what's just happened to us. So we set ourselves up to fail again. And to your question of why are there so many of them? And the book has a number of wicked problems, so things like plastics in the ocean, antibiotic resistance, obesity, chronic disease and diabetes, space debris, even before you get to what some people call a super wicked problem, which is the climate emergency. So what's interesting, though, is that Nassim Nicholas Taleb himself has said that COVID-19 is not a black swan, which is a surprise to a lot of people who've been using that label.
Yes.
But he's basically saying, we saw it coming. We should have known. We should have acted. We chose not to. But my green swan idea is, in a way, it riffs off Taleb's idea and saying, if most black swans take us exponentially where we don't want to go, where might we see evidence of trajectories or trends or technologies or solutions that could potentially take us exponentially where we do want to go? And so if we've got all of these wicked problems, all these things are going where we don't want them to go, what are the solutions that don't just address those problems incrementally, but have the potential to, to address them in an appropriate way, an exponential way? So that's where that came from. But in the conversation this morning, we were just agreeing that wherever you look now, there are these black swans, and I think it's a symptom of the fragility of our global system. Doesn't mean it can't recover, doesn't mean that we can't regenerate it, but at the moment, as it's currently configured, it's very vulnerable. The problem is, if you're a Bill Gates and you're largely talking about 5 years ago, say, epidemics or pandemics or health risks, that's one thing, because when they break loose, you can move to address them. With something like the climate emergency, the climate crisis, I think, we're probably already too late. I think that the system is already moving at an accelerative curve in directions we really don't want it to go. So I think as a herd animal, we choose not to listen until it's really, really clear to us that we have to move. Question is, do we have time now to address the climate emergency, or have we just simply left it too late?
In some of the part of the book, you also talk about the paradigm shift.
Yeah.
And do you think, or do you believe that we are facing a paradigm shift in the consumer market?
Well, it's interesting that choice of words, Kai, because a lot of people have used paradigm as, it's a new paradigm in flavoring in a toothpaste, or it's a new paradigm in bicycle wheels or whatever. But to me, like you, I think I read Thomas Kuhn's book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, when I was 14. And that book came out in, I think, 1961, sometime like that. And that was the book that introduced the notion of the paradigm shift. And 3 times I've gone back to the book because I couldn't believe certain elements of what I thought I remembered from it. And one of those was an experiment that was done in Hanover, I think, in the late 1800s, where they put distorting lenses on people's eyes and left them on for weeks. I'm not going to go into the story, just simply to say that when a paradigm starts to shift, those experiments suggest that for a lot of people, it's actually a pretty nauseating, sickening process, because everything you took to be solid is not solid any longer. Everything you took to be fixed is not fixed any longer. And I actually think we're in one of those moments where an old order, I was born in 1949. I've grown up in a world of the Bretton Woods summits, that sort of macroeconomic and geopolitical architecture. I think in many ways that's coming apart now. So a lot of people are looking for a V-shaped, a U-shaped, a W-shaped recovery. I think we'll see all of those, but I also think this is going to take a lot longer to clear, probably 12 to 15 years if history is any guide. But I think that's necessary. And I keep saying, I don't sound like an optimist sometimes, but I am. And my optimism is rooted in a reading of history, which suggests that only if the old order starts to die can the new one really start to struggle to its feet, which is, it's a messy business, but I'm afraid probably that's where we are now.
And normally we're coming into the discussion of business as usual, and has been in talk many years. And do you think we ever going to return to business as usual even after a vaccine?
I think some elements of business as usual will resume, simply because that is the way business is done. But some of the contextual stuff, some of the stuff around what we sort of sometimes struggle to identify as the system, I think changes have started to happen at that sort of level. So people are starting to think about the value of things, of the natural environment, for example. So we start to see the fundamental master discipline of capitalism, economics, starting to shift at the edges initially, but I think that will accelerate over time. So I think, yes, of course, people will try and rebuild the order that they felt familiar with, they felt comfortable in operating, they knew what to expect from. But I just think it's probably going to go well beyond that. And one of my assumptions is that in these sorts of periods throughout our history, and they come along perhaps once every lifetime, there tends right in the middle of them to be a major war. Now, I'm not predicting a third world war, but I'm saying that if our history is any guide, the likelihood is there will be a major conflict. And so people ask, who's it going to be between? And my answer is it's uncertain. I mean, it could be between America and China. It could be, given just recent circumstances, between China and India. It could be between India and Pakistan. There are so many possibilities. And with populist leaders in so many different parts of the world, the risk is that much higher. And you just had Macron scrambling his navy off towards Turkey because of an incident between Turkey and Greece. So we're in a very, very delicate period. And wars next time round won't be, massive tank battles in the Ukraine. There'll be things like cyber warfare, drone warfare. We saw the refinery in the Middle East blown up by drones in a semi-deniable way. That's the way these things start, but then they accelerate. So I find it very difficult to sort of make a straight line projection from where we are now to where we would need to be and say that's going to take us 10 to 15 years. I think this is going to be incredibly risky, incredibly dangerous, but actually probably the most exciting period in my entire working life, because suddenly, if we know what we're doing, we can drive change in a very different and very much more effective way.
As an optimist, you're also, of course, looking into the positive opportunities that such a crisis has created. Where are they?
Well, the point is that now they're everywhere. One of my favorite science fiction authors is William Gibson, who is famous for having said something along the lines of, the future's already here. It's just not evenly distributed. And I always add yet to that. A couple of years ago, with the Business Council for Sustainable Development, we did a project looking at the value of markets linked to the Sustainable Development Goals out to 2030. And by 2030, you will have seen, but the forecast was that just on 4 out of 60 of the sectors associated with the SDGs, the annual revenues potentially were around $12 trillion a year. Now that was considered a conservative estimate. So in a way, that these opportunities are all around us. Some people are beginning to move in those directions. I, for example, was on a call yesterday with a company I work with in Israel, UBQ Materials, and what they're doing is taking all of the domestic refuse that streams down hillsides in Israel and elsewhere in the Middle East, and they're turning it into a useful, saleable material. It happens to be a polymer. Some people might think we have too much plastic anyway, but this is a polymer that is starting to be used by companies like Daimler-Benz in their car structures. It's being used by McDonald's in their sort of serving trays and restaurants and so on. So that's a rather unexpected thing to take, this ghastly material and turning it into the sort of material that could be used in restaurants or underneath our feet in cars or so on. But everywhere you look now, there are these examples, and just one I think really very striking example is the way in which renewable energy costs have fallen, particularly in the last 4 or 5 years. You've got a factorial sort of fall in the price. So suddenly you've got the point where renewable energy, both solar and wind, is becoming cheaper than even installed coal-fired power stations. You project that forward 15 to 20 years, and you've got a picture where renewable energy isn't free, but it's radically cheaper than the alternatives. So I think we're standing on the brink of a technological revolution, and from that will come revolutions in food and nutrition and agriculture and energy and transportation, many things. So the simple answer to your question is it's hard not to see them when you look out the window, but you've got to know what you're looking for, the opportunities. I think information technology at every step along the way, from cuneiform tablets and the Babylonian world through the printing press to the personal computer and so on, and the sort of software industry that gave us Bill Gates, it's transformed our world. Very often on a generational timescale, if you go back to Babylon or you go back to the period of Gutenberg and the printing press. But as we all know now, we're in a period where there's almost a hyper-accelerative curve in the IT technologies that we're exploiting. And in a way, there's a risk that actually very slowly but drives us mad. I mean, it immerses us in so much information, we don't know what to do with it. And so one of the elements of IT that I'm absolutely fascinated by, and have been to see companies like HP and DeepMind before they were bought by Google, is artificial intelligence. So it again is on an exponential curve. And at some level, I feel the only way our species will be able to deal with and cope with and manage the world we're in the process of creating for ourselves is if we develop the right sorts of artificial intelligence, almost sort of artificial wisdom, if you like. I think we're a very long way off that, partly because the technology is behind the curve that many people picture it on. But it always happens that we exaggerate the short-term effects, wildly underestimate the longer-term effects of a technology like that.
But do you think that the governance issue has a role to play and play a more front runner in the society when we have new tools around us?
Well, I think the combination of governance and government is incredibly important. And I think in some ways we're coming to the end of an era that Milton Friedman defined, where he basically saw government as surplus to requirements. He had that saying that if you put the federal government of the United States in charge of the Sahara, we'd run out of sand in 5 years. And that was a very extreme ideological view. He was a very brilliant man, I don't deny that. But I think COVID-19 has shown the fallacy of thinking that we can do without government. The point is then, it's got to be the right sort of government. And is the right sort of government for the 20th century the right sort of government for the 21st? And I don't think the answer is yes. I think we've actually got to reinvent government. Now, in the past, that's tended to happen after civil wars or global wars. That's when you get these big jumps in governance and politics. Hopefully this time we can do it without that. But one of my very favorite social enterprises in London, where we both are, is apolitical. And as you probably know, they look at best practice across the political and government world, and then they pass on best practice to public servants. So I don't think we can just say government as it is should be slotted in and it'll work. I think government as it is has got to be changed and transformed, and then hopefully it'll work a lot better. But I think it's central.
Maybe create new type of relationship between sort of people in the society. And with the IT technology, we have the opportunity to also to support this development. But is it any reason that one of my priority issue has been talking about the lack of political leadership in the development, but I don't see much of that discussion in the book. I think there may you may have thoughts about it, but it seems to that the business society has developed their strategy much faster than the political leadership the last 20 years.
Yeah, we have to be careful because it's certainly true that leading companies, and this is very often a very small group of companies that keep popping up in different areas of the debate, have done some really thoughtful things, and I think often quite successfully. But the broad bulk of business is not yet moving in the same direction, which is why you need government action. What the book does talk about is the way in which what's coming at us, the disruption of all of our systems, will throw up a very different sort of and age of leader. And that will be as true in business and in financial markets as it is in politics and government. And I think if from the point of view of the early 2030s, we'll look back at the people who were in leadership positions now and say, whatever happened to them? Because, I mean, Greta Thunberg for me is almost an ideal model of somebody who explodes from nowhere and then sort of is suddenly talking to the UN, talking to the World Economic Forum. And we're in one of those extremely volatile moments where people with a very strong sense of identity and agenda can have a quite disproportionate effect. But of course, that goes for good, bad, and ugly leadership. As well. We just happen to be very fortunate that a young Swedish girl has done what she's done. But again, I think that's it's a sign of where the political system and dynamics are headed.
What do you think about the role the natural steps system thinking has for your thinking and development?
Well, I think in a way we have a slightly parallel development. So I was sort of coming up with a triple bottom line at the sort of same sort of time that the natural step community was evolving, and a lot of respect from my side for what the natural step people were doing. I think both sides had weaknesses which needed to be filled. I watched the natural step movement come out of Sweden into countries like my own country, the United Kingdom, into the United States, and so on. And it wasn't always an easy progression. That there was something about Swedish culture and Swedish politics which enabled the natural step to flourish there, which it didn't always do quite so easily elsewhere. But since then, we've had the Future Fit Foundation, Future Fit benchmark approach. It's complicated, but I think it's like software, can be complicated, but eventually it'll become simpler. So I think the natural step lives on in a number of different ways, and I admire it because it's of its science base. And I think so often now, and particularly in today's world, where we're surrounded by, immersed in false facts and so on, the scientific rigor, the scientific foundations of all of this are absolutely essential. If we don't have that, we're really dreaming rather than constructing a new reality. Well, I think one of the things that the natural step did very usefully was to give people a sense that their worlds, their realities, their lives and livelihoods were dependent on systems which had a very different timescale to the ones that they were used to operating within. And there's been a huge amount of conversation and discussion and debate over the years and decades about extending the timescales within which our societies and our economies and our businesses operate. And I think we've been singularly poor at really making that a reality. Every so often a particular CEO will stand up and do something in favor of the long term, but it tends to be somebody like Paul Polman at Unilever, who's just joined as CEO and therefore can't be thrown out. So he attacks hedge fund investors or whatever. But in general, people just keep their heads down and don't want to attract too much attention or flack. But I think just the last 18 months have been extraordinary because you've suddenly started to see major CEOs. I mean, Mark Benioff at Salesforce, for example, talking about capitalism being broken. You've seen Warren Buffett saying the same thing, but companies can't do this on their own. They've got to have the support of government. You had the Financial Times doing its wraparound front cover early last year. And basically, that you'll remember, it said capitalism, time for a reset. And now you're hearing that reset language in what business people are saying, what politicians are saying. Their difficulty is they've never done this before, and they don't see any safe way of doing it. So I think the natural step has set the preconditions for what a lot of what now needs to happen. But
Yeah,
we've got yeah.
Yeah, I think it's for me, it was also that we can learn from the mistake in the beginning. But in the beginning, when I met CEOs as Leif Johansson at Electrolux, and he went into Volvo after that, and
Yes.
IKEA, Ingvar Kamprad, when they implement the four system condition in their business model, things started to change. And this was nearly 4 decades ago. And
Well,
so we had something.
Yeah. But again, you think about Karl-Heinrich Robert, who I have enormous respect for what he did as a champion of the natural step agenda. And you think about somebody like Darwin. Darwin had to be dead for something like 40 years before people properly paid attention to what he was saying. And I don't want people to be dead, nor do I want it to take quite so long. But there is something that takes an idea and separates it from an individual, and over time makes it a little bit more manageable. Back to the conversation around COVID-19, I think we're in a point where all sorts of things that used to look impossible are suddenly becoming potentially possible and possibly even inevitable. And there's this accelerative curve going on. So I think, ideas that you and I have been involved and others like us have been involved now for 40, 50 years, it takes that sort of, that's how long a paradigm takes in order to, a paradigm shift to take traction. I think with the next 10 to 15 years, we're going to see progress, or at least change, off the scale greater than anything we've seen in our lifetimes to date.
Yeah. Let us go to another topic issue, which it's related to our pensions.
Yes.
So many of the investment and pension funds have parked great portion of their money in stranded assets like oil, airlines, fast fashion, and our aircraft manufacturers. They took a hit. And many investors and employees saw themselves losing their investment and jobs. Do you believe they ever have realized the true implication of stranded assets and how the future position is?
Well, if they haven't, they need to be retired themselves instantaneously, because you've had BP and you've had Shell both declaring very substantial multi-billion dollar stranded assets. And these are companies who for a very long time said to people like Carbon Tracker, no, we're not going to have stranded assets. We're too intelligent. We can see all of this stuff coming. Well, COVID-19 is the proximate cause of a lot of that stuff. But the climate emergency is going to do exactly the same thing. So to your question about retirement, I won't retire unless I'm forced to somehow. But I have got a pension. And last year, and because I've been freelance throughout my life, my wife and I have invested that ourselves through advisors and so on. And we got an independent advisor to come in and look at our portfolio last year. And we were horrified, even though we were invested through ethical and socially responsible investment funds, to see how close in our investments were to some of these really problematic industries that you've listed, and coincidentally to some of those potential stranded assets. So we stripped our money out of a lot of those things and we put it into the new economy. I have to say, it took a very long time. It took about 5 or 6 months of really sustained effort to do that as best as we could. Now, that should be incredibly much easier for anyone who wants to do that. We should all have the ability to steer our funds in a way that we see to be suitable. So I think the financial industry really has to have a very major shake-up.
So if you were head of a pension fund, how would you address your strategy to the board?
Well, I hope I would be head of the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, something that with real muscle and scale. Or I know what's going on there, and I know the CEO candidate, or at least I've met him once. I think I would pull in, and it's very clear that the pension funds, the best of them, will be doing this anyway, but they really need to be getting to know people who are driving the new economy, not just the comfortable, safe people that they know who run, the big battalions, the old companies, the traditional incumbent companies. Because in a period of disruption, a lot of those people will disappear. It doesn't mean that they completely disappear. They'll be taken over, or bits of them will be broken out and acquired or whatever. But again, I think in 10 to 15 years, we'll look out over a transformed landscape where many of the safe investments have just disappeared, the blue chips, so-called. And I meant 35 years ago, I started to talk about green chips. And I think it's very hard sometimes to identify who those might be. I started tracking Elon Musk at Tesla 15 years ago, at a time when most people had never heard of him. Now, I wish I'd invested in him. I've been invested in Tesla in recent years, but he could so often have gone off the road, and he may still do that. But what a rocket ride that has been, and in large part because he's a genius of a particular sort, and he's riding that wave of the new emergent economy. And in a way, that's what we've all got to do, and that's what even safe hands, pairs of hands, like the people running pension funds, have got to learn how to do as well.
I'm going to take this issue with me when I talk with one of the first CEO of a pension fund in Sweden who addressed the climate issue some years ago.
Yes.
And we're going to have a talk around the role of the pension funds. And I think he did a pretty important work to put up these issues as a strategical advantage, and also could show results of some years of work. And I think a lot of pension funds now are discussing how are we going to use our money to save the growing generation of people who really need to know how their future will be. And that's also, we come to one of my last questions for this book, is about the young listener. And what do you want to say to the young listener of today's podcast?
Well, I think our generation should probably say sorry. And the last thing I want to see our generation do, the baby boomers in particular, is to say, we tried, we failed, now over to you, and we're going to have our retirements or whatever. Because I think younger people are now facing challenges and opportunities, of course, but challenges on multiple different fronts in terms of employment and education and pensions and all sorts of different things simultaneously, and also confusion. Just at a time like this, when the old certainties are evaporating, it's very hard for younger people. And at Valence and our younger members of our team, and I'm just acutely aware that they haven't had the experience of going through, as in my case or your case, the oil shocks or 9/11 or these different things. This is new, and this is on such a scale. So my message to younger people is that probably this is going to work out. It's not going to work out in a very short order, and it's only going to work out if people don't get angry and violent, which I think is over time going to be a very real risk among younger people. It doesn't take many people to become angry for very major negative disruption to happen. But the generations have to learn how to work better together. I think that's absolutely critical. And that different age groups can bring very different levels of experience together. And that can't just be in communities. That has to be in national politics. It has to be in the sort of UN or sort of global level. And I think one way or another, we've got to bring younger people, not in as tokens, not as just to have them sitting by the door and say, we've got a young person over there. But we've got to bring younger people in at every level to prepare them for what's coming next, to listen to them, but also to be in conversation with them. And actually, I find that incredibly interesting and great fun. So I'm not saying this because it's going to be a huge strain. I think it's because it's going to be essential, but it's going to be exciting as well.
But thank you, John. And
thank you, Kai. And just again, thank you for the invitation. It's a great comfort to know you're out there doing what you do. I hope it doesn't take too long before we can get together again and have a proper conversation. But in the meantime, good luck and thanks very much indeed.
And we maybe not need to go to Dublin. We can meet in London.
I like Dublin, but wherever it is, I look forward to it.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. Thank you very much.
Bye.
I'm Kai Embren. Follow me on Twitter and LinkedIn, where I will be announcing the future guests to this podcast. And you can expect about 2 programs a month. And each guest has a unique story of making business and society sustainable. So find out more. Visit my homepage, kaiembren.org. Thank you for listening.